Valentine's Day. For more than 1,500 years, marriage partners get blessed on February 14th. It's the day love is celebrated, whether it be platonic in its nature or dearly heartfelt and passionate. It's the day of the hearts. Everything revolves around appreciation and affection. But that does not mean that Valentine's Day stays clear of people doing horrible things to others. In fact, especially on these days, violence is not uncommon. Unrequited love and wounded pride can become explosive and dangerous ingredients. Charles Walton from Lower Quinton, Warwickshire, England, was a man many people described as kind of strange, but not menacing or even not integrated in the local community at all. Charles Walton was supposedly born on May 12, 1870. People are not sure about his birthday, however, because there are no matching birth certificates or other kinds of documents proving an exact date of birth. As a young man, Charles Walton earned his money by training horses. He was exceptionally good at this and made very much of a reputation for himself very quickly. In general, he had a very uncommon relation to animals. It was said that when he whistled, birds would fly to his hands to eat out of them, and that he could tame wild dogs just with his voice. In his later life, he was known for his knowledge about folklore, rites and customs in the region. Nevertheless, some suspicion was raised about this. After all, Walton seemingly had no enemies, or at least none who would have ever made themselves known. Walton married and moved with his wife into a small cottage in Lower Quinton, Warwickshire in England, but destiny took his wife from him in 1927. For some time he lived alone, but adopted his niece, Edith Elizabeth Walton, when she was 3 years old. He took her to live with him even though Edith's father was still alive at the time. Apparently, the father could not or did not want to care for his daughter. It is not really clear why Edith's father was left out, but the important part is that Charles took care of his niece as much as he was able to. Exactly at this point, Walton, as a person, became a little bit more of a curious deal. Walton paid 3 shillings in rent for his home, as well as any amount of payment necessary for coal and meat to eat. He earned a weekly pension annuity of 10 shillings, plus anything he was able to earn with his jobs at the local farms and fields. Because even though he was about 74 years old and suffered from rheumatism, which tied him to a walking stick, he still sold his workforce to local farmers. How much exactly he earned in this time is not too sure, but he was able to seemingly not only pay the 3 shillings in rent, the costs of coal and meat, but actually even pay Edith a weekly pay of £1 additionally. To clarify the whole payment situation a little more, £1 was 20 shillings, and 1 shilling was comprised of 13 pence. So he was able to pay all this while only having a constant weekly allowance of 10 shillings. So he gave away way more than double the amount of his retirement annuity, which put him in a position in which he really needed to earn more money just to keep things up and running. Walton's workforce was very much appreciated. For the last 9 months of his life, he was working on a local farm called the Firs for a man named Alfred Potter. The last task he had to do before his contract was up for a renewal was cutting some hedges on a field called Hillground at the slope of Meon Hill. The hedges themselves had been only a couple of 100 meters away from Walton's cottage at the border of Lower Quinton. On Valentine's Day 1945, Walton left his cottage with his walking stick, a pitchfork and a slash hook, some kind of long-handled kind of sickle, heading towards the hedges. He was seen walking across the churchyards around 9 to 9:30 a.m. to cut some of the way. Edith at that time was working at the London Royal Society of Arts. She returned home at around 6 p.m. Even though Charles should have returned home at around 4 p.m., he was nowhere to be found. At first, Edith thought nothing of it and believed Charles was only visiting friends or simply just went to the pub. Because besides of having lived a bit secluded, he still was everything but a loner. After some time, however, Edith grew concerned and asked her neighbor, Harry Beasley, for help in searching for her uncle. The first place they went to look for Charles was at Alfred Potter's place, who naturally suggested they should start looking at where Walton was supposed to be working. On their way to the hedges, they found Charles Walton's body, beaten, speared and slashed with his own tools. As Alfred Potter stepped up to the body, Harry Beasley tried to hold back the screaming Edith, preventing her to get near the deceased uncle. At this moment, another villager, Harry Peachy, came across. He heard the ruckus going on, and Potter told him about the body and ordered him to call the police. Beasley took away Edith and brought her home to comfort her, while Potter stood guard at the scene. The first policeman to arrive at the scene was Police Constable James Lomesny. Later, other policemen from Stratford-on-Avon Crime Investigation Department joined the investigation and secured evidence as well as took first testimonies. The Forensics Department representative, Professor James M. Webster of the West Midlands Forensic Labour, arrived at the scene at around 11:30 p.m. Walton's body was taken away after the evidence was secured, which was about 1:30 a.m. in the morning. According to the autopsy, at around 1 to 2 p.m., Walton was hit over the head with his own walking stick, which was found lying on the ground about 3 meters away from his body, still having blood, hair and tissue on it. Walton had several defensive wounds. His left hand had a cut, the back of his right hand and his lower arm were bruised. Cause of death was a slit throat, done with a slash hook. Walton suffered several cuts and stabbing wounds from the pitchfork and slash hook. Plus, he had some broken ribs, most possibly due to having been hit with his walking stick. Walton's shirt, the upper button of his pants and his flower were open. He had a pocket watch on him on all days, but it was missing from the body. The research of the police and forensics concluded that at first Walton was hit over the head with his own walking stick and got his throat slit with the slash hook afterwards, after which the murderer took the pitchfork and rammed it so hard into Walton's neck that it basically pinned him into the ground. Then the handle of the pitchfork was jammed into the hedge's branches to stabilize it. After this was done, the murderer took the slash hook once again and threw it into Walton's neck, where it was ultimately left. Let's look at some theories about possible reasons for the killing of Charles Walton. 3 possibilities are put to the test here. The killing, done by one or more of the Italian prisoners of war from a nearby POW camp, a ritualistic killing due to Walton's alleged connection to witchcraft or paganism, and, of course, the killing by Walton's employer, Alfred Potter, which until today stands as the most probable course of events. The memo that was sent to Metropolitan Police, later also known as Scotland Yard, by the Deputy Chief Constable of Warwickshire, included the following statements. The Chief Constable has asked me to get the assistance of Scotland Yard to assist in a brutal case of murder that took place yesterday. The murder was either committed by a madman or one of the Italian prisoners who are in a camp nearby. The assistance of an Italian interpreter would be necessary, I think. Let's not dive too deep into how insensible and degrading this direct comparison between Italian prisoners of war and a crazed mad murderer is, but rather look at the arguments for the 3 most discussed possibilities. Near Lower Quinton, in a village called Long Marston, a POW camp was set up for Italian prisoners of war. These prisoners, however, had actually the possibility to move around freely, even outside of the camp. That was, of course, very unusual for any kind of POW camp, and of course, a possible culprit was suspected in the ranks of these prisoners very early on, because at this particular day, a couple of inmates actually went to Stratford for cinema and theater, which of course did not help the situation. But after all, none of the prisoners was actually considered a viable suspect over the course of the investigation. This was, amongst other things, because of the lack of a motive. Because what would have an Italian POW gained from killing a 75-year-old man and, at this point in time, suspectedly stealing a rather worthless pocket watch? The real mystery surrounding Walton's death is the stories that link him to pagan rituals, witchcraft and druidic or Wicca culture. There are a lot of possible indicators pointing in that direction. May it be a sacrifice to get better harvest, or just because the suspicion of Walton having been a warlock. We will examine this last suspicion a lot more carefully now. So let's take a closer look at the most used arguments for this. Walton was suspected of being a lot more than just an old man because of his unique ability to handle animals. His murder was allegedly an exact copy of a killing that took place 75 years prior in close proximity to Walton's, and which involved a supposed witch that too was stabbed to death with a pitchfork. He knew extremely much about local legends and folklore surrounding Lower Quinton and Stratford, and he also owned a book that told about folklore and legendary tales and proved it with supposed real events. And in one of these real stories, a young boy named Charles Walton met a black dog on 3 consecutive evenings. Black dogs in English folklore are kind of like the Grim Reaper. On the 3rd day, the dog was accompanied by the ghost of a headless young woman, and as the boy came home at that evening, he got told that his sister died at the same day. It is told, or believed, that the old man and the young boy Charles Walton from the book were the exact same person. Well, let's get to work then, shall we? First of all, yes, Charles Walton was exceptionally good at handling animals. Unique even. But with a little bit of sensitivity and a feel for animal behavior, nearly everybody, to some extent, can see, interpret and act according to all the small details and gives, all the nuances and gestures the animals give out. For example, cats are known to not only purr when they are comfortable, but when the exact opposite is the case. For example, when they are sick or close to death. Purring serves as a mechanism to calm the cat down and even supports a faster recovery from wounds and illnesses. Dogs lay their ears to the head, put their tail between their hind legs and growl and snarl, not from aggression, but often from fear as a means of defense in hoping of making the opponent flee before being involved in a fight. Especially wild animals are extremely cautious about their surroundings. If the animal seems to stop in its tracks and looks around, it is likely due to it looking for their pack, more enemies, a possible escape route and such. Standing still and acting slow and cautious might be one strategy to calm the animal down, but just like humans, animals have a comfort zone in which you need to be allowed into by them. Even walking towards them with your hand stretched out as a friendly gesture can be a guaranteed cause of flight or acts of aggression due to it being scared. Walton just understood how to read animal behavior and used this knowledge and gift to tame horses. Of course, one can see how this ability might seem very disconcerting to many people. Secondly, Walton also knew a lot about local folklore and legends. So what? Every person has its hobbies and interests. I mean, I'm into unsolved mysterious murder cases and disappearances and such, but does this automatically make me a murderer with connections to occult circles or the Illuminati or anything like that? Of course it makes sense that Walton gathered some of his knowledge through reading books, just like the one he had at home. This particular book, having a story in it in which the main character has the exact same name, is of course just coincidence. Maybe Walton kept this book even just because this circumstance. I mean, what would you do with a book that caters to your hobbies and interests and that has a story with a character in it who has the same name as yours? Walton having some interest in folklore is pretty much the only quote-unquote evidence can be sure about. Everything else is either pure speculation or mostly just fabricated to serve the inner need of having some relation and links between totally unrelated things. This leads us directly to the assumption that Walton was killed for being a warlock, which was supposedly proven by the quote-unquote fact that he had a crucifix carved into his chest. This argument is often supported by a killing of a 79-year-old woman that took place on September 15, 1875, the murder of Anne Tennant. Many people see an awful lot of parallels between the two cases. Both victims were very old. Both killings were committed in close proximity to each other. Long Compton, the place where Anne Tennant was murdered, is only 50 miles away from Lower Quinton, and both victims had been stabbed with a pitchfork. If you want to continue this supposed pattern, in which the statistic coincidence plays a major role as is, which I will go a little bit more into in my later explanations, one could of course say that both killings took place nearly 70 years apart. Anne Tennant was killed on the 15th, Charles Walton was killed on the 14th, and so on. I will not start to do these typical conspiracy theorists' tactics like playing around with the dates of the killings and their digit sum and stuff like that, no worries. But you see what I mean, I think. If one looks specifically for everything the cases have in common, no matter how big or small, you can and will find it, even if you have to go as far as stating, oh, both of them breathed oxygen, or they both eat bread, and stuff like that. This, of course, is totally hyperbolic, and it's only to illustrate the point I'm making here. It is only about the search for every and any similarity, whether one is aware of it or not. So let's take a closer look at Anne Tennant's killing now, since it is one of the major points people make when talking about Charles Walton's killing for being a warlock. Anne Tennant has been a 79-year-old woman from Long Compton, like I already told ya. On September 15, 1875, at around 7:30 p.m., she went to the village's bakery to get some bread for dinner. On the street, she met her neighbor James Hayward, who, with his stepfather, was on his way home from the fields. He had his pitchfork over his shoulder and a basket with his lunch hanging from it. Hayward was not necessarily the village idiot, but rather of a simple and feeble mind. When he saw Anne Tennant, he threw his basket, which had an empty wine bottle in it, on the street, walked over to her, and out of nowhere he started to stab Anne with the pitchfork. Hayward stabbed Anne's legs and hit her with a pitchfork handle over the head several times. Anne suffered stabbing wounds that bled profoundly, as well as injuries on her left temple and her right ear. After the totally confused and shocked bystanders realized what was happening, they of course came to Anne's aid. They detained Hayward and brought Anne to the house of her daughter Elizabeth that was directly at the place. There, Anne sadly succumbed to her wounds shortly after, due to blood loss and shock. When Hayward was detained and informed about his immediate imprisonment, he said, "No doubt. I hope she dies. There are 15 more of them in this village and I will do them the same. I will kill them all." Hayward was put into the nearest cell where already an angry mob had been waiting for him. Even in prison, he showed no remorse at all and repeated, "I hope she dies. She was an old witch. There are 15 more of them in this village and I will do them the same. I will kill them all." When police told him the following day that Anne Tennant died, therefore he would be charged with murder, he only replied, "She's dead? Well, then I did not kill her outright." A very strange statement that got followed by similar strange ones at the court hearing. Hayward also had a Bible on him at all times, in which he marked different passages he used to defend and explain the killing of witches. At the court hearing, he insisted that Anne Tennant was a witch and leader of a witch circle that cursed him into not being able to work effectively. He did not stop talking about witchcraft, the supposed witch circle and its curse. Even before the hearing, he tried to bribe the police into letting him go free, since all he did in his mind was done in perfect self-defense, which he also never stopped claiming. At the hearing, he did not stop calling Anne Tennant an old hag and witch either. It was brought to the court's attention, however, that Hayward's parents also firmly believed in witchcraft and the fact that their son was being tortured by these witches. At the same time, they stated that their son also would drink each and every liquor or gin that was put before him, no matter the amount, which would usually result in him not being able to control his aggressions when drunk. To put things short, Hayward was declared not guilty on grounds of insanity and put in a psychiatric ward where he starved himself to death a short time after. At the sentencing, the judge made it clear that the kind of superstition and ignorance that led to Ann Tennant's death would have to be stopped and had no place in a modern society. But enough with the tragedy around Ann Tennant. This summary should be enough to serve as a reference. Fact is, neither Ann nor Charles had a crucifix carved into their chest, and this supposed link between the two killings is nothing but pure fabrication to push Walton's death in a direction that is simply not existent, driven only by the wish or attempt to give it a more mysterious, supernatural aura. Ann's supposed role as leader of a witch circle was nothing but a basis to embellish Charles' fate. The similarity that both had been stabbed with pitchforks and that Walton took interest in folklore brought both cases a little closer together for interpretation, but still there was nothing tangible to prove anything. So the idea with the crucifix came right on cue. Of course, marking Walton as a warlock religiously by carving a cross into his chest brought him closer to the referenced killing of Ann Tennant, linking it even directly. But similar to the SMUB-85, however, this alleged injury came up only fairly recently, at around 2008 or something to be more exact. Because who could really tell more than 60 years after the killing whether there was a cross carved into Walton's chest or not, or whether Ann Tennant had the exact same injuries another 70 years prior? And if someone would go the extra mile and take a look into the original autopsy reports and files, everything would be, of course, denied as not having been recorded due to fear or conspiracies or whatsoever. Inventing, dare I call it, hoaxes like that is easy. Too easy, in fact. In reality, Ann Tennant was nothing more than a victim of circumstances, killed by a simple-minded religious fanatic drunkard who, after downing a bottle of wine he had in his lunch basket, lost his temper as described by his own parents and just let his religious paranoia take over his actions. Reality sometimes is just not as exciting and mysterious as one would wish. But let us not end the possible killing of Charles Walton due to religious superstitions just yet. We will come back to it. But first, let's take a look at the third thesis about Walton's possible killer. The most likely scenario puts Walton's employer, Alfred Potter, as prime suspect. Actually, many circumstances point towards him, even though there is no real concrete evidence. Still, some questions remain unanswered. One question always leads the list when looking at a crime, a question investigators and the victim's relatives alike ask. Why? Who had a motive to kill Charles Walton? Was it a planned murder, a crime done on impulse, or maybe even self-defense? In the most cases, a crime is committed by someone from their personal environment of the victim, relatives, colleagues, peers, friends of friends, and so on. First of all, the murder seems to not have been planned thoroughly, but to have been more likely committed on impulse. If one was to plan a murder, you would most likely bring a weapon of sorts. Even if you believed that there would be tools or weapons at the place, you still would bring your own weapon. Maybe even especially when thinking about this. The victim might turn the situation around on you, if he or she got access to the weapons too. The killer would always bank on the element of surprise and each and every advantage he could get. No matter how old or weak the victim would look like, a killing that would have been planned for some time thoroughly would not risk anything like that. Alfred Potter made himself look very suspiciously early on. His behavior at the crime scene led to believe that he knew way more about what happened than he admitted. On his first interrogation, he already seemed to make some strange suggestions. He complained about the evening getting colder and wanted to leave the scene before the investigators even arrived and could interrogate him. He seemed unfazed by the fact that his employee laid there slain on his property. It just didn't concern him. His priorities seemed a little off. When investigators arrived and interrogated Potter for the first time, he recalled his day as follows. At first, Potter said that he was with another farmer, Joseph Stanley, at the pub College Arms until noon. After that, he walked over a field adjacent to Walton's workplace and saw him working the hedges in around 500 to 600 yards distance. Walton had about 6 to 10 yards left to work. When the body was found, he had about 4 yards left, which was worth about half an hour of work. Additionally, Potter stated that Walton usually went for lunch at about 11 o'clock and worked continuously until 4 p.m. afterwards. Potter also said that Walton was neither aggressive nor belligerent in any way, but spoke his mind if necessary. Joseph Stanley confirmed Potter's statement of having been with him all morning. He stated that they had castrated 2 calves the day and went to the College Arms afterwards, where Potter had 2 Guinness between 11:45 and 12 o'clock. At his second interrogation on February 17th, Potter talked more about his business relation between himself and Walton. Walton worked on 4 days a week, but never in the rain. He was paid 18 pence an hour. As I said, 12 pence equaled a shilling and 20 shilling equaled a pound. Payday was sometimes once a week, sometimes every 2 weeks. Potter let Walton write down his working hours without actually checking. He implied, though, that Walton had himself paid for hours he never actually worked. Walton's last payment was on February 10th, and it was about £2 and 15 pence. When asked where Potter was heading when he saw Walton on the field, he replied that he was on his way to attend to some sheep and calves. He gave a more precise time of when he saw Walton, and it was said about 12:20 this time. He also stated that he would normally have gone over to Walton for a short talk, but he had no time since he had to get to a young heifer that had drowned in a ditch a day before. Potter went straight home, where he arrived at 12:40, and afterwards went to attend to that drowned heifer. On February 20th, Police Constable Lomazine went again to the Firs and had a talk with Potter. At this time, Lomazine casually stated that police were still trying to get some fingerprints from the tools. Like a shot, Potter stated that he touched the slashhook and possibly the pitchfork too when he checked on Walton's body, implying that police shouldn't get suspicious if they would find his fingerprints on them. This allegedly was done on behalf of Harry Beasley, who told him to check if Walton really was dead. Potter also claimed to have told police this in an earlier interview. At this moment, Potter's wife became upset and annoyed at him stating the obvious, that now police would suspect him even more, especially if his fingerprints would be found. While his wife was grumbling, Potter insisted that the killing must have been committed by one of the fascists of the POW camp. Shortly after, a supposed soldier walked into Potter's garden and stated that the military police had apprehended a suspect and civil police forces were on their way to take the man away. It was at this moment Potter and his wife cheered hysterically. Police kept Potter under close suspicion. On February 23rd, Potter stated that after he attended to the sheep and calves, he went home and read the newspaper for a short time. After that, he went to one of his employees, Charles Henry Batchelor, known as Happy, to pulp mangold. Both looked at some time at the church's clock and noted that it was 1 p.m. Potter's wife agreed to this statement. According to her, and further confirmed by Charles Batchelor, Alfred Potter left his home at 12:40 p.m. and returned home at 13:05. Towards Edith and the coroner, Potter too stuck to stating that he saw Walton around noon working on the hedges. To Edith he said that every Wednesday he had to milk the cows and wanted to get some hay when he saw Walton. Police went on to investigate Potter's economic position. Potter actually worked for a company that was owned by his father. This company had no debts or anything. Additionally, police requested information about a test wages investigation that was undertaken some days before the killing, and the information was given reluctantly, but after all turned up nothing. A later questioning of former employees of Potter, however, turned up that Potter from time to time had problems with paying wages. It was found that Potter claimed more money than he actually had to pay to his employees and pocketed the difference. Ironic if you think about how he basically accused Walton of claiming more hours of paid work than he actually worked. But of course, Walton himself was investigated too. His financial status was pretty surprising, however. Walton had more than £220 in his bank account at 1930. Between 1930 and 1939, however, this amount had dwindled down to about a little over £11. Walton had regularly withdrawn money, but never more than £10 at a time. It is possible that the money went towards supporting Edith because Walton never lent any money or had any IOUs. Where the money went remains virtually unknown, however. So far about the testimonies and statements. Let's now continue with dismantling Potter's statements and his alibi, shall we? At first, Potter's statements about his days seem plausible. He stuck to his recollection of the events, and the times he gave to police only diverged insignificantly. But if you look a little closer, you can see that Potter's version of his day actually changed quite much. It started by him seeing Walton working on the hedges at 12:10, then 12:15, then 12:20, and ended with him seeing quote-unquote someone stationary at the hedges at about 12:30. That's quite a difference now, is it? But not enough to call Potter a liar or suggest any foul play yet. These kinds of changes over time are not uncommon. Where the problems begin, however, is the testimony that Potter supposedly saw Walton working without his jacket, but that Walton had his jacket on. This means that Walton must have put on his jacket in the meantime, which regarding Potter's statement of Walton having worked hard makes no sense, unless he was preparing to go home. Keep this in mind, it will get important later. The drowned heifer Potter was allegedly on his way attending to that day, preventing Potter from walking over to Walton, was in fact not pulled from the ditch before 15:30 p.m. that day. Let's now remember the length of unattended hedges. If 4 yards would have taken roughly half an hour to attend to, and Walton, according to Potter at 12:30 p.m., had around 6 to 10 yards left to work on, he would have finished 2 or 4 yards in between 12:30 and his time of death, that was put between 1 and 2 p.m. A work of about half an hour. The time Potter came home. Potter's alibi, however, leaves a gap between 13:05 and 15:30. A pretty fitting time frame, huh? Potter's claims towards possible fingerprints on the murder weapons were invalidated pretty fast. Not only did Potter not state this fact to police before his talk with Constable Lemesney, but Harry Beasley himself actively denied to have ever told Potter to check on Walton's body at all. An often seen phenomenon with murder cases is the return of the killer to the scene. Potter returned to the murder scene on February 15th, shortly after sunrise. After he was told to leave the scene by a constable standing guard, he started to do some small talk again, complaining about the cold weather. Potter then gave the policeman a cigarette and left. Shortly after the killing, 2 employees of Potter quit their jobs suddenly. It was the same 2 men who were questioned by police, stating that Potter sometimes did not pay on time. This, plus his whole behavior actually, naturally made him look suspicious. Police statements say that Potter seemed to be grumpy and sullen, but always composed. He never lost his temper or composure once, even if put under pressure by police interrogations. He was described to be a bit dull-minded on first sight, but police believed he was everything but this. They believed he was a man of not only considerable strength, but a very cunning one indeed. No direct evidence was found that put Potter at the scene. After all, he lacked a motive too. Due to his habit of claiming more pay than he gave out and pocketing the difference, he made a nice dime off of Walton, which he now had lost. But how can one still link Potter to the crime? The pocket watch, as a possible souvenir, as a trinket to sell or anything, is out of the window, because it was found in 1960 when Walton's outhouse got renovated. It seems like Walton lost it there. But this makes the murder more specific, however. With the only valuable item in Walton's possession missing on that day of all things, a robbery now seems out of question. This would mean that the murder was committed for the sole purpose of killing Walton. Let us imagine the whole situation as follows. Walton's savings were nearly down to zero. Potter did not pay the full amount, or at least not always in regular intervals, and the rheumatism gets worse on this day. The cold weather, Potter described himself, worsened Walton's condition. Potter actually comes across Walton after his visit at the College Arms, but contrary to Potter's statements, Walton is not as fit as usual. Potter ignores this, not thinking much about it, and continues his day as usual. At home, he learns that lunch still needs a bit of preparing, so he continues to do a small job. At 13:05, he returned home again, eats lunch, and actually plans on walking to the ditch to get the drowned heifer out of there. Again, he comes across Walton, who did not attend to as much of the hedges as Potter would have liked. Maybe Walton even had a break because of his rheumatism getting worse. Being the grumpy man Potter is, he walks over to Walton, but the conversation goes bad. Payment becomes a subject, and Walton wants to stop working, but Potter insists on him finishing the work. Walton denies him and starts putting on his clothes. Both men get angry, and as Walton puts his clothes in order, Potter furiously grabs Walton's walking stick and hits him multiple times over the head. To make sure his action remains unrecognized, he decides to kill the old man. He takes the slash hook and slits Walton's throat, something Potter is used to due to his work. But Walton is a robust man, so Potter wants to make sure Walton will never be able to get up again and maybe even find help. He takes the pitchfork and rams it into Walton's neck, puts the handle under the branches, pinning him down and preventing him from ever getting up. Since Potter already had castrated calves at this day, any blood that might have gotten onto his clothes from killing Walton would not be suspicious at all. Potter leaves the scene and prepares his alibi. But the coroner's research put the time of the murder in between 1 and 2 p.m., a time frame Potter has no alibi for. Potter slowly realizes what he had done, and when he quote-unquote found Walton's body, he gets way more nervous than a person used to slaughtering animals would usually be, even when finding a dead person. Killing Walton gets to him. He uses the time Beasley was away calling the police and Edith was escorted home to cover his tracks. After that, he just wants to leave the scene and tries to elude police interrogations. When he heard from the already difficult search for fingerprints on the weapons, he immediately, on impulse, tries to explain his own fingerprints away. Additionally, he tries to drag suspicion away from himself onto the perfect scapegoat, the Italian POWs. The euphoria overwhelming Potter when he heard about the apprehension of a possible suspect was due to him thinking that he now was off the hook, because who would have believed the fascist POW anyways? But since the search of fingerprints turned up nothing, there was no proof linking Potter to the crime at all. So this course of events is just a possible scenario. It's not perfectly reconstructed, and not even a representation of Potter's supposed overall collectedness. But maybe this one meltdown, with all its violence, scared Potter himself. Having to be calm and collected, and having to suppress your feelings all the time, will someday result in a violent meltdown, and this can be triggered by even the smallest of things. This might be one thing that happened. Like I said before, I wanted to continue a possible explanation of Charles Walton's death due to a supposed relation to witchcraft, because there is a possibility that if it would be true, it would put the whole thing back into focus. it might be possible that Anne Tennant might have been the actual great-grandmother of Charles Walton. Anne Tennant's maiden name was Smith. The maiden name of Charles Walton's great-grandmother was Anne Smith, and an Anne Smith, written with E in the end, was registered as having been born on April 12, 1794, and her death was on September 15, 1875. So there is no doubt of this being the woman slain by James Hayward, Anne Smith that became Anne Tennant. But should Anne Smith, Walton and Tennant having been one and the same person, Anne Smith would have had to marry Charles Walton's great-grandfather Thomas Walton at the age of 17 or 18, given birth to Walton's grandfather, and after the death of her first husband, she would have had to marry John Tennant in 1917, living out the rest of her life as Anne Tennant until her violent murder. Would this be the case, it would throw a whole new light on the question whether Walton had something to do with witchcraft, and if it might not even have been run in the family for real. But of course, I don't just go with possibilities when I can dig deeper. And I found the following entries in the official birth, death and marriage registries. As I already said, Anne Tennant was born Anne Smith, written with E in the end, on April 12, 1794 and died on September 15, 1875. This is the Anne Smith we are looking for. Actually, only one single marriage is registered to this woman, the marriage to John Tennant on her birthday on April 12, 1917. No other marriage or birth of children had been registered to her prior. If she would have married John Tennant after Thomas Walton, she of course would have been Anne Walton, and there is no matching constellation in the registries. One could argue, of course, that she would have taken her maiden name after her first husband died, but even then, the first marriage would have been registered to the exact same woman, wouldn't it? If one searches for Anne Tennant or Anne Smith, one gets the same date of birth and death, but not if you search for Anne Walton. Overall, birth, death and marriage dates of Anne Smith, who became Anne Tennant, and Anne Smith, who became Anne Walton, just do not math up. So I myself was not able to find a link between Anne Tennant and Anne Walton. This, however, does not necessarily mean that there is none. The registry entries could be incomplete, but as they are of now, they do not show any connection, any relation between Charles Walton and Anne Tennant. Again, this is most likely more wishful thinking than reality, as thrilling as this idea might sound. Charles Walton's death remains officially unsolved, and even with Alfred Potter as the all-time prime suspect, theories involving witchcraft, occultism and everything superstitious stay alive and remain prominent in people's heads. Until next time, sweet nightmares.